Welcome. Thank you for joining the online version of The Art of Storytelling. I just want to say at the top, really big thanks to the Mill Valley Public Library, an amazing resource. Really looking forward to our libraries being open again. I'm really jonesing for my local library. I want to thank Andrew Murphy at the library and the staff there, and Franklin Walter, who is doing all the behind the scenes work to make this come together technically right now. Just so you know, as we go along, you can submit questions in chat, and then I can see those as we go along, and Franklin will be forwarding those to me. So just in general, anything that comes up, you have questions, that's fine. I'm going to take a couple of opportunities during the hour or so that we're going to do this and answer those. And then maybe if the opportunity arises, a couple of interactive things where I ask folks to submit things off of some of the material I've been talking about, just a sentence or two that pops into your head. And so, yeah, here we are sitting around the digital campfire, which is, I think, really appropriate for storytelling. It's an intimate medium, and this is more intimate than usual. But I do a lot of radio, and one thing I really like about radio is the sense that one person is talking to me, and it feels very intimate. So we'll see how the Zoom can approximate that kind of intimacy. Also, I'll just say at the top, my website is dougcordell.com, DougCordell.com. And it has video and audio on there. If you're interested, there's an email sign up on there as well. There's a calendar of shows I do, other classes I do. But if you want to email for whatever follow-up resources are on there, feel free. And so I'll just talk a little bit about my background briefly as a storyteller, how I got into this, and then some of the lessons I learned along the way. And basically the way I see this going is a sort of overview of the art of storytelling, mostly with the emphasis of live presentations, whether it's storytelling shows or work presentations that you're sort of trying to turn some data into compelling stories, or just being a better storyteller at a cocktail party. But I think a lot of the basics of these story elements that I talk about will be really appropriate for written form, dramatic form, if you're memoir or screenplay. The basics of story are story. So I try to address both. My background, I got an MFA, a Master's in Fine Arts in playwriting at NYU. And when the big playwriting money wasn't rolling in, I got a job as a speechwriter for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. It was a sort of ideal melding in a way of the dramatic spoken word form and sort of my own political junkie tendencies. And then from there, I actually got into writing for children's television. And that was great story camp, learning how to pitch little episodes in like one or two sentences. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's a great way to kind of boil down ideas and see if you have something that's material for a story, personal story or otherwise. Then I kind of graduated from that into writing essays, sort of David Sedaris-y kind of, humorous essays about my own misadventures. And out of that, radio stories. For first Marketplace, I did little humorous radio commentaries, they called them. Mine were like 2-minute personal stories about my economic misadventures, of which there have been many. And then also, more recently, Snap Judgment on National Public Radio, which is a nationally distributed show, but it's produced here in Oakland, where I live, where I'm talking to you from right now. So there, the videos and the audio from those shows are on my website if you want to see those. And Snap Judgment in particular has a great archive of audios and videos of stories in general if you want to get a resource of other storytellers. Some things that I learned along the way, to me, I've sort of looked back at my career, and every story has sort of woven itself into all of the aspects of my work. Um, Not by design, how these things go, but obviously there's a part of me that's really drawn to that. I think all of our brains are wired for stories. This is the human brain, and people really have come to be aware of that. In recent years, in particular, it's very big in the corporate world. It's very big in the political world. What's your narrative as a candidate? Um, and it's how we make sense of things. It's why if you can turn data, for instance, in a work presentation or some sort of marketing campaign or whatever, into stories, it sticks with people a lot more. We are primarily emotional creatures. We're not logical creatures. And most of the key decisions we make in life are emotional decisions that we then sort of rationalize in retrospect. Um, I'll tell you, to me, as a storyteller, if I were to say what is the most important thing someone needs to be a good storyteller, is empathy. And I even say radical empathy. And I don't mean radical in a political sense. I mean the ability to deeply empathize, not sympathize, which is different, but to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to be able to look at somebody, even someone that you find unsympathetic, someone you don't like, but to imagine what it's like to be in their head as a character. Also, empathy for yourself and doing personal stories. You see yourself as a character. Um, that will, that is a great gift to see our own actions with that kind of generosity. Um, just empathy for yourself. Also, we're really eager to walk in other people's shoes because we're just existentially separated from one another. And more so at the current moment than ever, right? So we really want to know what it's like to be you. What is it like to be you? What is it like to be another human? Um, because we learn that the things that we're preoccupied with in our private moments, it's not just us, but also we also learn about people who are wildly different from us and live in completely different environments and have completely different experiences. And that's broadens our world. So, people just, you say, I'm going to tell you a story. People lean forward. They want to hear it. I'll say briefly, I did a storytelling trip in Morocco where I was a storyteller in residence on that trip, teaching Americans and Europeans and then working with Moroccan and storytellers, Berber storytellers in the cafes in Morocco who've been these, guys in their 70s and 80s have been doing this for decades. And what I learned from that was their stories are not the kind of personal stories that I do, like Moth style stories or the kind of stories that the Mill Valley Library does at their Naked Truth series. They're fables, sort of like the princess and the teapot kind of thing. But stories are stories, and they are basically the same elements. And so, what are those elements? What are those basic elements? Um, if you were to ask me what is the most important element of a good story, I would say conflict. Conflict is key to a good story, unless you're really doing some experimental writing to see if you can write a story without conflict. And, people have done it. But it's good to know how to, draw the human form before you become a cubist, as I say often. So, conflict, if you think about works of art, it doesn't matter whether it's Snow White or the Brothers Karamazov or Romeo and Juliet or whatever it is. There's a conflict, right? Romeo and Juliet. The conflict. These two young lovers want to get married, but they can't because their families are warring factions. They're rival clans. If you don't have that conflict, there's no play. right? So it's good to think of our own personal stories and even stories for work presentations in that same light. Like, what is the conflict here? And you can often find that when you're talking about things that are more sort of marketing or work oriented. And I can talk about that a little bit more. So conflict is essential to a good story. Something is at stake, right? It could be small, personal story, could be a job you want or a man or a woman you want, or not so small, but it could be something huge. But as long as if it's a personal story, as long as it's emotional for you, it'll be emotional for us. We'll walk in your shoes if you let us feel what it's like to be you in that moment, in a job interview, in taking a drive. It could be taking a driving test. Is potentially a hilarious, especially for someone who's older, who hasn't driven, or remembering back on first day of school or whatever it was. If you put us in your shoes and let us feel what you were feeling, it will be dramatic. That's dramatic. So something's at conflict, something's at stake. And when I say something's at stake, you think of Broadway musicals. They have something early in the first act of Broadway musicals that in the business they call the I want song. And the I want song is like, I want to be in the chorus line, in a chorus line. And that tells you what the character wants at the top, not at the end of the first act or in the second act, but early on. So we know. And the same thing with your stories. There's a dramatic build. There's what they call rising action. Things are getting more and more and more tense. The music is swelling. Dun, 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 dun. We care is another key element. We care. We care about the characters, whether it's you or other characters. And then at the end, there's some takeaway, which it doesn't have to be heavy-handed, like families are important or something like that. It can just be a little button or a little takeaway for the reader, the audience, that gives them some sense of, makes the story resonate beyond the telling, beyond the page. I learned not to take myself so seriously, or whatever it is. Or so I learned that sometimes love isn't where you go looking for it, or something along those lines. So those are the basic building blocks of a good story. And you think of classic dramatic structure, you're talking about the introduction, complications, crisis, climax, and a resolution. It's the same idea, basically. Stories in general, unless you're being, again, sort of avant-garde, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the end is key, especially with live storytelling. A lot of times people don't have an ending. This is the biggest problem that I find as someone who works with storytellers, produces storytelling shows, teaches storytelling. And you will see I have done live shows with folks who are up there on stage fumbling around for quite a while because they don't have an ending. And so it's good to know what your ending is when you're going into it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, as far as personal experiences, I heard a woman from, I believe she was from Kenya, did a storytelling show with me. And she talked about teaching these village women who are really, a lot of them are victims of trauma and abuse, who have fled. And she's teaching them storytelling as, a way to put some perspective on their experiences. And what she said is, if it's a wound, it's too soon to tell that story. If it's a scar, you can tell that story. So you do with that what you will. I thought that was a great way of talking about personal experiences that are still too raw for you to have that perspective to put it into a story. So I mentioned that I worked in children's television. The Book of Pooh, Winnie the Pooh, Bear in the Big Blue House. I was very big in the 2 to 4-year-old set for quite a while there. 10 or 12 other shows. And in that, as a staff writer, you have to pitch stories. So what you learn is what they call in television and film It's a very simplistic formula, and it is reductive and it is simplistic, but it's good to keep in mind for your own stories. And again, I don't care what format it is, what form, if it's a story, and it's um, called the XYZ formula. And basically, the way it works is, and I'll talk about this in terms of popular movies, this is the story of X who wants Y but can't get it because of Z. So this is the story of X who wants Y but can't get it because of or without overcoming Z. So X is your protagonist. If it's a personal story, that's you. You're the hero of your story. Y is what they want, what you want. And Z is the obstacle that must be overcome or may not be overcome. So you think of, and these can be, the obstacle can be, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, internal or external, and both often. You think of The Wizard of Oz, XYZ. This is the story of Dorothy, who wants to go home, but can't without seeing the wizard. That's the basic action of the story. Now, obviously, what makes the story magical and resonate beyond that is her, where she is at the start of the story, the lessons she learns, the partnerships, the friendships she makes along the way, the terror of the Wicked Witch and all this stuff. But that basic arc is what everything hangs on. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Tootsie. It was, I don't know, a long time ago now, but Dustin Hoffman basically plays a character. He plays an actor who is such a pain in the butt to everybody that he's burned all his bridges and he can't get any work. And so his agent says, I can't get anything for you. And there's a big role coming up on a soap opera. He has to get the role, he pretends to be a woman in real life, like within the movie, to play this character on the movie. And that's Tootsie, right? It's a little dated in terms of the concept today. And so he does. And the twist is that he falls in love with his co-star, Jessica Lange. So that's XYZ. It's the story of Michael, the character who wants to get a role on a top soap opera, but can't do it without pretending to be a woman. And then the complications ensue. You can basically look at that in terms of a lot of movies. Rocky, I'll just say this, and I'll ask folks if anybody's interested and wants to weigh in on chat, if they would tell me obviously we know whose story it is because it's in the title, Rocky. This is the story of Rocky. What is Y in that? Rocky is X. And what is Y? What does Rocky want? A lot of people assume one version, but I think it's something else. So anybody wants to weigh in on that, and I'll come back to that. The other aspect of storytelling that's very big, and I talk about this a lot, is character is story. And even if personal stories, character is really important. So there's always two stories going on. There's the internal story and there's the external story. If you think of Silence of the Lambs, for instance, those of you who have seen this, the Jodie Foster character, Clarice, the external story is she's trying to catch a serial killer and she has to engage with Hannibal Lecter to help get his expertise to help her catch this guy. She's an FBI agent. The internal story, which Anthony Hopkins pulls out of her to play with her because he's a former psychologist and a serial killer himself, is that she's got this very troubled childhood background and her own issues with her father, abandonment, and how she was raised and moved around, shunted around as a child. Those two things are both motivating her, right? So she has an external goal, which is catch the serial killer, but then there's this other business that's going on. Similarly, The Godfather, which is one of my favorite movies, and the protagonist of The Godfather, the ex, people have all kinds of answers to this, but it's really Michael Corleone. It's Al Pacino. It's his movie. He's the one whose internal conflict we get a window into, like a Shakespearean character, like a Hamlet, like a Macbeth. He is the one, his internal conflict is that he wants to go straight. He doesn't want to be in the family crime business. He wants to be straight and be a success in the straight world. And he's a war hero, and he's married to Diane Keaton, who also wants this. And he gets pulled into the family business when his father is killed and none of his brothers can step up. His internal conflict is he likes the power that accrues to him when that happens. And so he keeps telling himself he's going to be, and telling his wife he's going to get out and go straight. But he keeps pulling him back. And he literally says, just when I think I'm out, they pull me back in. But it's his own ambition and ego and love of power. Warring, so he's at war with himself. At the same time, he's got all this external conflict of the other mob families who are trying to kill him, and the cops, and the crooked senators, and everything, the investigation by the Congress, and everything else. So there's two stories there. And it can be more esoteric, that conflict, right? It doesn't have to be quite so cut and dry. It can be a sort of ephemeral Bridesmaids with Kristen Wiig. It's a comedy. It's a romantic comedy. But what she wants is really to be taken seriously as an adult. She wants to grow up. She doesn't have she wants to be the bridesmaid, but even that, and put her on her friend's wedding. But all this other business she has a bakery that goes belly up and things like that. So those two things happen together. And so you can use that formula with your own stories. Look at it in terms of, do I have a clear objective, and what's stopping me from getting it? I will just take a second right now. I don't see any questions on chat, but I just wrote down questions for myself, because there are a lot of things that come up that I get asked a lot. And so I'll just touch on that. And obviously my background, and I don't know if you've been to the Naked Truth series that the library puts on. It's a quarterly storytelling show, live storytelling show, free wine. You have to register. The whole event is free. And it's, 300 plus people. It's great. I've done it probably 5 times. Great storytellers. And then in sort of open hat, put your story in a hat in the middle. Those live storytelling has a particular kind of format. And a lot of people ask me about, what are some of the rules of the road of that? Does it have to be your own story? Can it be somebody else's story? In that world, in storytelling, in the Moth, Snap Judgment, these live shows, the live storytelling shows that are all over in New York and LA, and then Naked Truth, the format is basically, it's your story, it's true, and you're not telling a fable, and you're not telling your aunt's story, and you're not making up an ending. And people say to me sometimes, does it have to be funny? No, it doesn't have to be funny. A lot of those shows are funny, and sometimes there are comedians who are telling stories. Funny is an easy way when you're telling a story to register a live audience's reaction. But on the other hand, If they're not laughing and you're telling a funny story, it's a very obvious that it's not going well. So it can be just as advantageous to tell a story that has moments of humor. And the great thing about storytelling, and I've done stand-up comedy as well, storytelling audiences are much more open-minded about the form and the content. So you can have stories like great literature, great art, that are both humorous and serious by turns. And they don't have to have a funny ending. They might, um, like life. So no, it doesn't have to be funny. It is supposed to be, should be in the first person if you're doing that live storytelling. So I did this, I met her, we went there, that kind of thing. Um, it doesn't have to be, people say, can it be a happy story? It can be a happy story, like a happy ending or whatever. But again, there needs to be conflict, right? Always some conflict. And the conflict can be sometimes your own overcoming a personal phobia to accomplish something, overcoming fear, um, or something more external. Um, so anyway, I'll just leave that for there right now and talk a little bit more about live storytelling. And you can see here, I put this up here. This is actually that's me photoshopped into a noir dime novel cover at a Mill Valley show at the Throckmorton Theater a couple years ago. And this was Snap Judgment did a live segment. So the producer for Snap Judgment and myself did a closing segment where I told this story of mine, The Accidental Cop. So in terms of that form, the live storytelling, and even personal essays and memoir, I tell people, think of it as a little movie starring you, a little movie starring you. So in that sense, you want for the audience and for the reader, paint the scene, right? Show, don't tell. So if it's a harrowing job interview or a date gone wrong or, whatever the traumatic situation is, paint the scene. Like literally, what does the office look like? Little details, not everything that happens, but what's on the wall? What does the person look like who's talking to you? What's your emotion going into this? Paint the scene, and then the characters. Think of them as characters in a movie, including yourself, and give us a sense of, if it's a friend of yours who's a character in that story, you may not think to give us a sense of what Julie's like, but just the briefest stroke will give, Julie, you can just say, I'll just say this about Julie, she's a worrier. And that's enough, right? At least it gives us a sense of her, and then it's relevant to the story, whatever's going on. The other thing that people ask me, they'll say to me is, nothing dramatic happens to me. Where do you get ideas for stories? I don't have that problem. Dramatic things happen to me, especially in my younger days. But the thing is, every day of our lives is filled with drama. Just being alive and being human is a dramatic, extremely dramatic life and death experience every day. And again, seemingly small things, a driving test, a job interview, a date, can be fodder for a good dramatic story if you let us know what's at stake. If it's a job interview, you let us know, I talked my way into a job interview for a job I'm not really qualified for. That's A. Then you'd let us know I'm not good at job interviews. B. My girlfriend or boyfriend told me, you better get a job soon or you're out. see. So now more and more of these things are at stake. And then we go into the place and the person interviewing us is not making eye contact, and there's something very off about the whole place, and you just paint that scene. That's dramatic. And that can be a 10-minute story, believe it or not. So it can be things like that. Very common. I talked about a driving test. There's a writer for the New Yorker and for The Nation, the columnist for The Nation, Katha Pollitt, but she wrote a piece for the New Yorker. And it was about being a woman in her 50s, a New Yorker, an Upper West Side New Yorker who never learned to drive, like a lot of New Yorkers. And the story is a very funny story about her learning to drive in her 50s. And taking driving, going to driving school, and she has a very wry New York sense of humor. But what comes out in the process of the story is that the reason she has to take a driving test and get her license is because her partner, her boyfriend of 25 years, has left her for a younger woman. And she's not only, she folds this in later. So this is the emotional content of this story. And it's about learning to drive, but it's also about navigating the world now on her own. And it's funny and dramatic. So a driving test, a job interview, any situation of faking it, prom night gone wrong. You're outside your comfort zone, things like that. Spalding Gray, who sort of invented the solo theater form, he was a very neurotic guy, like a lot of comedians and storytellers. And he did his most famous is called Swimming to Cambodia, which is about his experiences filming The Killing Fields, which is about the Cambodian Pol Pot regime. And he had a bit part in that movie, but it was really about the crazy experience of being on set with all these people in, I believe it was in Vietnam or wherever they were, Thailand. But he weaves it around his own personal crises. And for him at that point, he's having a strained relationship with his girlfriend back in New York. He's sort of at a midlife crisis moment. And he does that with all his shows. So you weave the personal into these experiences. And I will just say, again, if folks are interested, and I believe it's you basically, if you want to weigh in on chat, you're on YouTube. It's fairly straightforward. There's a area there where they can just type in on the screen questions, or in this case, if somebody has the idea for a pitch for a personal story or another kind of story, any kind of story. And when I say pitch, literally, it's like the setup, what they call in TV, they call it a springboard. And it's a 1 or 2 sentence thing. My story, The Accidental Cop, is a true story. And is basically the setup, the pitch basically is when Doug, and if you're doing these pitches, and whether you do it now or later, think of your stories in this way. Use your name as a character. And so, so for me, when Doug moves into what seems like a great deal on a New York City apartment, when he moves in, he's mistaken by the drug dealer in residence as an undercover cop. And he, basically, in order to keep this crazy building quiet, he lets this misimpression linger with unintended consequences. That's a true story. It's harrowing at the time, funny in retrospect. Um, so think of your stories like that. If anybody wants to type one in here on the YouTube chat thing, a story of yours that's like, and just in general, if you're thinking of premises, for instance, Tootsie, I talked about before. Basically, the premise for that is, to get a role on a popular soap opera, Michael, that's Dustin Hoffman's character, who's a cranky actor who's burned all his bridges, has to pretend to be a woman in real life to get the job. And, complications ensue when he falls in love with his female co-star. That's the synopsis of that movie. A personal story could be something like, to bond with her new in-laws, Sylvia invites them along, on a weekend getaway in the mountains. The weekend turns into a very long week when a storm snows them in. Okay, that could be a personal story. And you think of your story like that. It's a way of knowing that you have an arc to this story, and all the emotional stuff, all the fun stuff, all the humor is going to be hung on that clothesline. But you have that architecture. And really, storytelling is like building a house, a structure that's going to stand up. It's structurally sound. And the magic, all the kind of things that we think about, the dialogue, the humorous turns of character, fold into that. Just as with The Godfather, all the pageantry and the character actors and the music and the drama and the famous lines that we remember from this movie. But without that arc, Michael's arc, which is continuous all the way through Godfathers 1, 2, and 3, which is not very good, Godfather 3. And that arc, it's never resolved. That tension for him is there the whole time. He wants to go straight, but he keeps allowing himself to be pulled into the power of being a mob boss. So you have that sort of architecture to hang your stories on. So, if it occurs to you or something like that, also any questions people have about anything in general, storytelling or story shows or something you're working on, can be the memoir, can be how to turn a work presentation into stories. I'll talk about that. The other thing is, especially with live storytelling, but in general, it's great for written and also film and TV, obviously. I talked about beginnings and endings. If you're doing a live storytelling event and you're doing your own story, usually they're like 10 minutes, know your beginning and know your ending. Those are the real keys. And compelling beginnings and compelling endings are great for storytelling. In comedy, you always save your best joke for last. You never open with it, but you open with a good joke. And then you have a lot of stuff in the middle that you hope works, and maybe it's some new material. But you open big. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, and he had been a kind of B-movie actor for many years before that, was asked while he was president what the difference was between show business and politics. And he said, they're really the same, which is indicative more of Reagan than anything. He said, you open big, you cruise for a while, and then you have a big finish. That's how he saw politics and show business. You don't want to cruise for a while in the middle, but open big, close big. So you think of a teaser opening. I talk about this a lot. Charles Bukowski, a famous sort of alcoholic former postman novelist, sort of the bard of the LA dive bars. His first novel, Post Office, which he wrote in about 6 weeks, based on his really sort of grim personal experience as a postman in LA. The first line of it is, it began as a mistake. And that's a great opening because he can then digress into, some background stuff and whatever, because we know it's going to come back to something dramatic. What was the mistake? How did it play out? What were the consequences, right? And that's a great technique to open with something that grabs people, even if it's vague, but it implies drama to come. Then you can digress. If you open with something that's already sounds sort of digressive, especially live with a live audience, you really need to hold people's attention live. It's not like they're reading, their attention will drift. You don't want to come out and say, clouds drifted across the October sky as I pulled in to the office parking lot, in a short story, perhaps, or in a novel even, but even there, I would say it's better to have something that's a dramatic grab and then fold back into that. And you can go digress all over the place because we know you're going to get back to somewhere interesting. I have a story that's another apartment misadventure in New York. And it's called Hot and Bothered. There's a video of that on my website as well. And the opening of that, my opening of that is, this is a story I don't come off well in. I like the story, but not particularly proud of my role in it. So immediately I'm acknowledging, A, it's a story. And I'm sort of teeing up without giving anything away that, you're going to see some, socially approved behavior by me, which could be funny and dramatic. You can start a personal story with a line that just says something like, I'm not an outdoors person. Let me tell you that up front. And then you weave into a story that's like a camping trip gone terribly wrong. Anyway, yeah. So those are examples of great opening lines. Closing. The thing about an ending, which is really good, is a lot of times real life, in particular, doesn't have a neat ending like a movie. And I opened the door, and there was the man of my dreams, or whatever it is. That's the romantic movie. He went running through the airport and caught the girl. But you can create an ending for real life events by a takeaway. And the takeaway can simply be, you talk about what happened, and there is some resolution of action. You either got what you wanted, or you didn't get what you wanted, or what you thought you wanted, or then you realized you didn't want what you thought, whatever it is. But when that story is over, a very little bit at the end, because when the story's over, the story's over, which would be something to the effect of, I guess looking back on it now, what I think is, and whatever that takeaway is for you, I'm more, I'm better, improvising than I thought I was, or whatever it may be. So you can create an ending for a real life story by doing something like that. Not heavy handed, not again, love, friends matter kind of thing like that, but something, there are creative techniques, particularly with personal stories. And this again, for memoir, even for work presentations. A lot of times I have people they do presentations for conferences, work conferences. And those might be, I had one woman who, in one of my classes, she is a pet groomer. And she also speaks at pet grooming conferences. And so she wanted to take these stories, instead of just doing a PowerPoint that says, here are the sort of 7 key steps for effective pet grooming and working with clients, is to tell stories of, pet grooming incidents gone wrong. So even in a case like that, And with real life in particular, one thing you can do is, for instance, link three vignettes that are thematically related, that have an arc, that move in a particular direction. And if it's your personal life, it might be three incidents from your relationship with a family member or a friend over time, for instance. You know, when I was 15, you cold open, they call it, just right into the scene. When I was 15, I walked into the kitchen and my mother was sitting at the table crying. And then that scene, and you give us a snapshot of fast forward 10 years, I'm 25. I'm coming back from grad school. My mother is waiting, meeting me, blah, 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 whatever that vignette is, that also illustrates another aspect of this arc of this relationship. And then, the final one, and these things often work in threes for whatever reason. That's no coincidence that a lot of drama is 3 acts and comedy works in threes. So a third one might be, recently I, attended to my mother at her deathbed, and some conversation that happens. And that arc, you can fashion an ending on that, saying, and it will have an emotional arc of the journey of that relationship. But then I think, the takeaway can simply be, I think, when I think about it now, what my mother was trying to tell me was blank. So I do see a question. Oh, this is from the Mill Valley Library to everyone. Okay, good. What do you do when the monster on the bed turns out to be you? This is the Mill Valley Library asking you guys. No, it's not. Okay. I see. So this is from someone. Okay, good. It's telling me it's from the library to everyone. So what do you do when the monster under the bed turns out to be you? I like that question. That's a good question. I think the thing about that, I'd like to hear some more specifics about the actual situation involved. But metaphorically, the monster under the bed, that gets into the whole thing of like internal conflict. So I'm getting a little more information. When I was a child, I was afraid of the dark and vicious people, but came to embrace places where love and light did not shine, and became that which I feared. When I was a child, I was afraid of the dark and vicious people, but came to embrace places where love and light did not shine, and became that which I feared. Okay. Batman. Yeah. Well, I, again, without too many specifics, I will just say the internal conflicts that we have, which obviously nature and nurture, right? Wherever they come from, they're there. And you can do origin stories about where those come from. But the question is, in the story you're in, how does that inform what happens, right? So you bring that to the story. So in terms of just telling that story, to let us know a hint of what that conflict is, and then the turn when the monster in the bed turns out to be you is a great reveal. And that's just going to come in a skillful setup and letting out enough information that we're invested in it and we have some sense of the drama to come, but not so much that it gives away what's going on. So anyway, there are a lot of different creative techniques that you can use for. Yes. Okay. Belated answer to what Rocky wants to prove himself. Yes. Good answer. I mean, a lot of people say, what does Rocky want? And this gets back to the XYZ formula I was talking about. the story of X who wants Y, but can't get it because of Z. And a lot of people say what Rocky wants is to be champ. But that's not really what he wants. He doesn't think for a minute that he has a chance of being champ. He gets tapped by the kind of Muhammad Ali character in that movie, Spiros Arion, to be the great white hope, this working class guy from Philly, and it'll be great drama on TV. And he suspects he's being made a chump because he's a nobody. He's a club boxer. And all he keeps telling his girlfriend is, I don't want to make them to make a fool out of me, right? He wants to be taken seriously. So yes, he wants to prove himself. So it's all his internal, it's all about his self-image, that whole story. It's not about him getting the championship. And in fact, I don't want to spoil this for anyone, he doesn't become champion in the first one. He loses, but he fights all the way to the 15th round, shocking everyone that he's stayed in the ring with this champion. And at the very end of the movie, they've both beaten each other to death and they're still standing. And the Spiros Arion, Muhammad Ali character, says to him in a clinch, ain't going to be no rematch. And Rocky says, don't want one, right? He's gotten what he wants. And, the movie ends. And it's a classic structure, but a lot of people think what he wants is this external thing. What he really wants is self-respect. He wants to prove himself to himself more than anything. He wants to be taken seriously, sort of like the Kristen Wiig character in Bridesmaids. And that's a very compelling, we all have that. We all have our voice in our head telling us we're losers, we're worthless, we made bad decisions. That's a very compelling, you need to externalize it enough that we can know that that's the conflict that's going on and what's driving you. I'll talk a little bit more just in terms of live storytelling. If folks are interested in doing that, well, some creative techniques. I talked about linked vignettes, 3 vignettes. You can also start at the end of a story, like literally at that sort of end point, and then back up to how we got there. So the ending would be, I was being driven to the hospital in an ambulance, my house having collapsed or whatever it is. And then you back up and tell us how you got to that place, and then pick it up again at that ending point and just complete that. That's a really compelling way to get people right into a story. And even if it's not a hugely dramatic story, to get into that. You start at that moment that's right on the cusp of the climax or in the middle of it. And then back up and tell us how we got there. And then when you come back up to that point in the story, you follow through on that. That's very common in novels and movies. And it's a great way to grab people right in the middle of action and pull them right into the story. Often the advice for people in all kinds of creative writing is start further into the story. Most things can benefit by cutting. Start further into the story, start mid-scene. I walked in and, I showed up at the office that day and there was there were pigs wandering through the hallway. I don't know why, but, whatever the story is, right into that scene. And you can also digress at a cliffhanger moment. And that's a really effective technique because you have people hanging, So I took the baseball bat and I went back into the hall, and then you pause and say, here, I would just like to pause for a second and ask you to consider the fact that, our bodies are, I do this in a story, our bodies are made up of cells that continually regenerate. And it's sort of a humorous digression into sort of exculpating me from any guilt for what I am going to do in this story. But the reason it's funny and I'm able to do it is because it's a very tense moment in that story. And I bring people right up to that moment. I have them hanging. And then I say, let me pause for a second and ask you to consider the fact that our bodies are continually producing new cells and sloughing off old ones. This is a biological reality. And it's funny because it's tense. They're waiting to see what happens. And I'm playing with them. I'm playing with that tension. I'm teasing them. So those are all kind of techniques you can use for effective storytelling. Again, for work, for personal, for whatever. In terms of live storytelling, just some practical tips in terms of doing the actual performance, the shows. Um, I tell people when you're telling a story, and again, in any form, it's just like talking to friends over wine. We're natural storytellers, and the way you would recount some bad day to your friends. Let me tell you what happened to me today. Um, and that will be that's a natural rhythm that we fall into. I just got a question from Victoria, looking for storytelling techniques in business. So there you go. Narrative conflict is not dramatic, and the takeaway needs to be strong. Any advice? So I guess what you're saying is the narrative conflict in the material that you're dealing with does not seem to be dramatic. It's not apparently dramatic to you. I'm assuming that's what you're saying. You're not seeing where there's a dramatic conflict in this material, and it needs a strong takeaway. So this is really good because I have done training for people who deal with journalism and people who are sort of public affairs officers for nonprofit organizations or government agencies or whatever. And they're trying to get their story out there. And they'll say to me, why are journalists so negative? And they're not negative. They are looking for conflict. And so if you don't give them a conflict and serve that conflict up, they'll create one in the headline or somewhere else. And you're telling a good, happy story. You might be telling a story. I did work with folks, this wildlife refuge that was, an endangered butterfly that came back from the brink of extinction and is restored on a former, naval base or whatever. It's now a wildlife refuge. But the story they were telling was just about this wonderful restoration. And the reporter that they were working with seized on this little conflict that the landowner, the agency, was having with some cranky farmer next door, because they didn't serve him. And the narrative conflict was in there. And the conflict was butterfly that had been on the brink of extinction and was on the cusp of blinking out forever and being lost to this area in the North Bay that it's the only way in the world it exists. And it was through heroic efforts of citizen activists fighting against, landowners and pulling together and getting that made this thing succeed. And if you give that to people, that's the conflict they will seize on. So in this case, in terms of business, the narrative conflict, it's hard for me without knowing specifics, but there is a conflict in there. I guarantee you, I could find it. As I said, with the pet groomers, right? Often the interesting things are what doesn't work, right? Stories about what doesn't work and why it doesn't work, whether it's a personal story or just a generalization about why it doesn't work. So if you're talking about what does work, the contrast would be with what wouldn't work. And that's a conflict, right? What it came up against and how it didn't work. But even a successful marketing campaign or a product, every product is proposed to solve some problem, right? Some need, whether it creates a need and then proposes itself as a solution, which is often the case with advertising. But there's a conflict in there. And if your audience is people that you're trying to share management advice, maybe something like that, would be to talk about examples of things that don't work and why, because that's dramatic, and overcoming conflict. Or personal experiences with things that didn't work. But there's a conflict in there. And the conflict can also be, you can personalize it if you're talking about your own experience and your own sort of hesitancy at the outset of this journey with using this technique or this management approach or whatever it is, or learning it yourself, your journey is a personal journey. You can personalize anything. And that is your dramatic arc, where you came to this takeaway. And the takeaway then is more powerful because you've turned it into story. And you've taken what was maybe some bullet points or data and turned that into a personal story or a sort of larger, parable about how those things work. And I've worked with authors who are on tour who've written nonfiction books and are looking to do just that for their live performances and for their readings and their book events, is to take some of that stuff and turn it into compelling stories. And the ways to, rather than a friend, I'm going to wrap up here shortly, but a friend of mine wrote a book about police reform, and he talked about these terrible incidences of the police who don't want to have to do this, but they've sort of been, with budget cuts, given the social response of last resort for mental health crises and all kinds of things. So you have police showing up like in a housing project where somebody with mental health issues is acting out, which happened in a case he was talking about. But my friend wrote a book that talked about the general trends of overusing police, and he reeled off a lot of data and statistics at the outset of his talk. And I said, tell me one case of this police intervention in a mental health crisis that went wrong. And he did. And I said, what was her name? How old was she? Did she have children? And he told me all of this and personalized her story. And it was very touching and sad. And I said, tomorrow night at your next event, open with that story. And he did. And when he came out, he said, he said, I want to tell you a story about a woman named Rebecca. She lived in a housing project in Brooklyn. She'd been living there for 30 years. She had mental health issues, and her neighbors knew this. Occasionally, she would act out. She had 2 sons, both of whom had died, and she lived alone. One son was a victim of drug wars. The other died in Iraq or Afghanistan. I don't remember. And one afternoon, she was having a particular episode and raving and ranting and raving in her apartment, and a neighbor called 911. And instead of mental health professionals showing up, the police showed up. And these are 2 young cops, not trained for this kind of intervention. And again, the cops don't want to be doing this, in full uniform with all the badges, all the hardware dangling and banging on their belts, and guns, obviously. And they go into the apartment, and she, in the middle of this some episode, she picks up a broomstick and swings it at this young cop who's relatively new on the job, and he shoots her dead. And tragedy, all the way around. And it didn't have to happen. So he opened with that story and told that story, and everyone is hanging. And then he backed into saying, between 1990 and 2019, the use of police in blah, blah, blah has increased to a lot. That's a great example of storytelling and how you can take these kinds of data and other information and turn it into compelling stories. So I hope that's been useful for you. Again, thanks for joining, and thanks for the Mill Valley Library. Looking forward to the library being back open soon. I'll just say quickly, again, my website, dougcordell.com. You can get on my email list. If you're looking for resources for stories, just to get in the mind of storytelling, I don't care whether it's business or personal or anything else, snapjudgment.org. There's only one E in judgment, snapjudgment.org, and also the Moth. And it's the Moth, just like the insect, .org. Both have tons of stories on their website and video and audio. And those are curated So they're good stories. It'll get your mind thinking in terms of what's an effective storytelling technique. Yeah, feel free to follow up. You can get me through my website, and look forward to seeing folks again, either here or in person at the library. Okay. Thank you.